Hello all and happy Friday. Welcome to our live stream today. I'm super excited to get into it with Emily Lonetto. She's the head of growth at a company called Voiceflow. They are a no-code solution for building voice and chat apps for platforms like Alexa. In Emily's time at Voiceflow, they've grown from zero, from starting out from scratch essentially, to over 65,000 users in just about 2 years. And so today we're going to be talking about the growth strategy that they've used at Voiceflow. We're going to get into the specifics of how she thinks about the different growth tactics that have gone into the plan, how they've used community, how they've been able to find product market fit, and a lot of other really great growth focused topics today. As always, I want to just give a couple quick plugs for our company Optimist and our community, top of the funnel. So first and foremost, if you have not already, please like the video here and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We host live sessions and workshops here every 2 to 3 weeks, generally on marketing, content, SEO, growth topics of all types. We're focused primarily on startups. So if you want to learn from some of the smartest people in the industry, definitely join us for future sessions, and probably the best way to do that is to subscribe here. And also liking the video just helps other people find the content and hear what Emily has to share. The second thing I just want to mention is our community. So Optimist runs a community. It's a free Slack group for marketers really of all types. We focus on content and SEO, but all kinds of growth for startups, agencies, freelancers, all kinds of folks. That group is called Top of the Funnel, and you can join it for free by visiting yesoptimist.com/tofu, TOFU. Again, we'd love to have you there. We have all kinds of folks there, including freelancers and agency folks, as well as in-house marketers and SEO experts and all kinds of folks. So if you have questions or you want to just, again, learn from really smart people, we often host Q&As. We share exclusive videos and content and lessons and things in that group. So would love to have you join us there. All right. Well, with all of my marketing and sales pitches out of the way, I'm gonna go ahead and transition to our discussion for today with Emily. As I've already said, super excited to talk with Emily about her experience at Voiceflow and how they've approached growth, their unique strategy, I think, that really has blended community and content and these product-led principles. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and bring Emily on, and we'll get started. Hey, Emily, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited. I know you and I were just talking briefly backstage, where I think there were just so many people like fired up about just the big picture view of the 0 to 65,000 users that you guys have achieved over the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always interesting to kind of like look retrospectively on, okay, like what were those strategies? What were those things? And excited to kind of dive into what are the things that worked for us? What were the things that totally didn't, or just the experimentation framework that went into it?
Yeah, definitely want to get into that. I know, as someone who's worked in startups and worked with startups and all that, I know it's never as clean on the inside as it looks from the outside.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, I want to get started on something that's a little bit off topic, but I was chuckling because I was going through reading some things that you published and all this stuff, and one thing that really struck me was that I guess you just sort of mentioned it, this kind of data-driven approach and experimentation and sort of testing and measuring things. Do you sort of consider yourself to be like a particularly data-driven person?
I mean, I would definitely say like I am by no means a data scientist. The reason why people go to school for that and are amazing at it. I think that the way that I really approach it is like I love data. I think that it adds like a really necessary and very contextual element to storytelling. And in particular for growth, like if we're not backed up by data, like who's going to gut check you? Who's going to gut check yourself? Like what's going to be the founding reason why you focus your time on certain things. And I think I've always been the type of person who is creative by nature, but likes to back up and likes to strengthen my argument with data always.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. I think especially just the era that we live in now, it's like, I think for, if you could rewind, 50 years or whatever, like marketing was more, I would say, more of a pure creative,
Mm-hmm.
endeavor. It was really closer to art, where it was like, yeah, we're trying a bunch of stuff and we think this is working, but we don't really have a way to measure it. And now it's like, you can pretty much measure anything, really, right? So it is really a much more of a 50-50 split between the creative side and the analytics portion.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I think like some of the best people in the space are those that like are able to kind of dive into that or like get creative on how they access or translate that data. And we're in a really interesting era, especially with marketing, where there's so much metadata and there's so much behavioral data and analytics that you can get into. And it's exciting to tie that back to a persona or even yourself when it comes down to kind of figuring out even what bucket you fall within.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great point. I definitely want to get back into that, and hopefully we can kind of discuss how you all have used data in Voiceflow and sort of what your decision-making framework has looked like over the last few years. But the most important thing that I want to know is you published this post from 2018. You catalog your entire year of numbers, which that was actually what sort of led me to this discussion about data-driven, right? It just for the folks watching the stream, right? So some of the highlights in your post is you found that you had finished 35 books. You drank, I think it was like 500 coffees at 59 different coffee shops. Yeah. And you made plans with people, I think it was like 329 days out of the year, which is like, as an introvert, like it's just mind blowing. But I'm super curious what that process was like. How did you put that data together about your own life?
Yeah, I mean, like the year in numbers project was an interesting one. It was like, okay, like I had spent a lot of time starting to like over the years, like realize that there are like these weird ways that you can pull a lot of these different data points about yourself just by like doing logins or kind of connecting different data sources. And I thought that it would be a fun challenge to, instead of think about, okay, like what are my like New Year's resolutions, instead of like framing that on like, okay, like how did I actually spend my last year, more of like a retrospect. And it was a creative exercise to kind of think about like, okay, like what were the new trends that I had picked up and really stuck with throughout that year? What were the things that were going to carry over into the next? And I think we kind of talked about this kind of offline, but I had a 2019 and a 2021 written, but it was a little awkward and sad in comparison. Given the fact that a lot of my points were about like extracurricular activities and the way that I spent my time outside. Like I remember there's one point in that where I talk about my Uber trends, how many rides that I had, the repeat drivers that I had and I didn't realize, which was a plugin that I found online on Reddit. And then I had graphed that in 2020, and my number of rides dropped like a cliff, and my Uber Eats orders just like went up into the right. And I just didn't want that out in the world. I think that it's an interesting exercise to do, and especially if you're a marketer, it's really fun to see what type of persona that you actually are.
Yeah. Again, I think like the lesson there is super interesting because you think about how we use data in our professional lives, but it's like the same principles can sort of apply in a very personal setting and a very personal topic as well, which I find pretty fascinating. So I want to jump into the history of Voiceflow here. I know, as I kind of explained in the intro, I think you've been with the company now for somewhere between two and 3 years, and you guys, you basically joined as an early employee. So can you just tell us a little bit about where Voiceflow was as when you were joining the team?
Yeah, so Voiceflow was a very like interesting and like long tail kind of decision to kind of come in and join. And I had originally gotten affiliated with them as their first advisor before they were even Voiceflow, where I had known Braden, the CEO, for a few years leading up into that. And he had always been like a curious, genuine, like very excited founder to kind of work with or kind of follow along in his journey. And at the time when I got involved as an advisor, they were actually a company called Fable, then turned Storyflow, which is much more similar in name to Voiceflow. And what they were doing then was they were building interactive children's stories for Amazon Alexa, which since then has become like a niche that we serve, which is kind of interesting. But I had joined to kind of figure out and help out a team that were deeply creative, deeply excited about an emerging tech, and we're just trying to figure out how do you even get started in an industry that isn't carved out yet.
Right.
And it was really, like, as a growth person, really freaking exciting. Where my day job at the time was we were solving how do we, I was at Clio at the time, and Clio is an amazing legal tech company that's trying to solve the legal tech space and bring them into the 21st century. But like that is like an existing really core pillar industry. And like a lot of it has been figured out. A lot of it's like, how do we get more strategic about competitively taking these people and up-leveling them? Whereas this was a totally different problem. So that inherently was very exciting. And I think for me, when I went away from being an advisor to like something going off in my head of being like, okay, like this is a team that I want to work on full time with, was there was a core moment where the team had not made it into YC. They had a YC interview. For those of you on the call who are not familiar with this, Y Combinator, very popular incubator out in the Bay. And one of the things that I realized when I was talking with them was that like it's all about scaling. At the time, they were so micro-focused on growing like a beloved audience in interactive children's stories on a smart speaker. They really killed it at that. But what they had inherently done by creating and becoming beloved in that space was they solved a deeper problem of like, how do you just build for this new interface? And they had unintentionally created Voiceflow. And one of the things that I distinctly remember saying was like, when you move away from being bound by your own content creation and you can scale by empowering others to create on top of you, then you're going to grow. And 2 months later, they switched over to Voiceflow, and I'm having a conversation with their CEO about coming on and helping build that.
Wow. Yeah, that's super interesting. So you were actually involved in those kind of early discussions that really shaped the company as it exists today.
And yeah, I mean, like, I think that it provides like a really awesome like color and like background knowledge that like you don't normally get when you look at later stage companies. And like there's something that was so, it was a challenge that there was no way I could walk away from. Like, it's like, I really, really wanted to challenge myself in my own domain. Like, can I do it here? And my background, you may have picked up on with the year and number stuff, is like, I like data, but I also really like design. And working on a platform like this allowed me to kind of meld both of those together while still encompassing a lot of community stuff, which I had done previously time and time again.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. So I mean, at that point, so I must assume then you came in. I'm assuming probably, I don't know, one of the first 5 employees or something at the company. It sounds like it was
would have been 6 at the time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And in the process, you know, you guys are sort of as a team discovering this whole new like business that you're kind of starting from scratch basically. So like I'm always curious about like what was like the first customer acquisition like how did you acquire the first initial customers once you figured out this new path forward?
So I think like one of the
results from the apps on your TV. I'll need to share your voice with them.
It's all good. It happens all the time in my office. Don't worry about it. As you can imagine, I have a lot of smart devices on my desk, and we also have a lot of meetings about those smart devices. So I think like we were in a good position where we were very beloved with like parents and people who had known us from StoryFlow. And one of the things that we had said early on, because we were working in a niche, is that you can't rely on these like core target groups that you could with like ad subsets, because like you needed a minimum size, and like they weren't looking for these types of triggers previously. So we basically had put together a strategy that put all of our customers into what has now become our broader community. But at the time was just like our early users all in there for feedback and for just engaging with each other. And that first group of parents who were interested in eliminating screen time before bedtime ultimately also birthed like a niche of parents who are like, oh, like I want to build stories like this for my kid when you guys aren't doing it anymore. Like how can I do that? And they became like the early subset of our users. And then now it's like, okay, where do we go where other creators like them have like similar ideas of wanting to be a maker or have this idea, and we want to democratize it, make it easier for them to do that. And so our first obvious pivot was trying to now align ourselves and deeply relate with the no-code community and the maker community. And that became a huge portion of our now strategy and early subset of users.
That's super fascinating. So yeah, you all had this existing audience that I have to assume, like, you probably thought like, oh, these folks aren't going to be our customers in the future now that we're moving this whole new direction. And it actually turned out that there were some of your new customers in that subset. That's super fascinating. How did you, I guess, how did you sort of discover those people who were actually interested in it? I guess did it just kind of happen organically through that community that you built?
I think like one of the things that I love about embedding community as a strategy, especially early on for startups, is like a lot of this is very organic, and it comes from having lots of conversations or just opportunities to have those conversations. And in a lot of cases, I find a lot of startups, they build in stealth, they build quietly, they release something, and then they kind of wait for people to come. And in a lot of cases, there's lacking that opportunity to kind of have those conversations more regularly. And especially early on with our developing of the product, it was integral that we had those conversations frequently so that we were building to actually match a use case that wasn't just limited by what we had thought it was. And in particular, when you're looking at like a product-led growth strategy, you're building for the masses, and you're building for like this quick time to value, quick scale up opportunity, and the ability to connect with a lot of people very quickly. And so definitely like one of the things that lended well with us was that like we had built that right at the core, and that continued to kind of be the centerfold for how we got a lot of our early product feedback, and continues to be like how we frame things now. Because it's always going to be a human conversation about what we're building, because ultimately we are building for humans. And that's important to kind of keep at the core of whatever strategy you're using.
Yeah, that is super fascinating. I want to now jump into that kind of concept, because I know one of the things that we wanted to discuss today is, I guess, how the community that you all built essentially was sort of a flywheel, or like an engine for actually finding your product market fit as a company. Can you talk about that? Maybe like, what were some of the key moments that you remember over the last few years of, I guess, collecting specific insights or making decisions based on what you saw in the community?
Yeah, so I think like community is an interesting beast, and one that's like super hot right now amongst marketers and growth folks alike. And I think that for us, there were a lot of really key moments on like starting to see people who were organically sharing their stories, organically like connecting with people. It wasn't this group wasn't a place for us to have another promotional channel. And for me, when I'm building community, no matter what company or whatever my background is for that, I'm really trying to look at like, are we building a strong meeting place for these people? Are they developing their own habits? Are we facilitating that? I don't ever want to build a community where it's a billboard, but instead is an opportunity to connect with each other. So I think like starting to see some of the early users like start to share stories, or more importantly, start to answer each other's questions and like hype up each other when they finished a brand new project, or would volunteer to test each other's projects or partner up for like hackathons. Like that's when it really kind of went away from it being strictly about product feedback to them actually making product interconnections. And then more recently now, like people sharing and finding jobs through that, or like legitimizing and quitting their day-to-day to go join full-time as conversation designers elsewhere.
Wow, that's amazing. What were there, I guess, did you have kind of a playbook or a strategy for trying to facilitate or spark some of that, interaction between members of the community?
So I think like it's funny. It's like we as humans are so good at building and nurturing relationships, because it's just like at the core of kind of just human connection. The second that you toss that into like an online forum, people get so weird about it, where it suddenly like requires this brief and this like whole structure and a KPI right out of the gate. And like the truth is that like even if you're planning a party, you can only really put the pillars in place and like kind of hope that the right people come in and facilitate those micro connections. And like building online community is very similar to that, where like you as a host or an admin are responsible for kind of setting what those pillars are, what's like in the room. So what resources are accessible, what are the hashtags perhaps that you're using, or the organizational system. And then like also matching that to like the medium and like the time that people are doing that. So similar to when you're hosting a gathering, like if I invite you over at 8 a.m. and I have like a Texas Mickey of like Fireball there, you're gonna look at me like a little weird, versus like if we had like tea. So like those are different elements of like matching you as an audience, the time to the medium of where we're meeting. And so like from a playbook perspective, like that's important. So like our Facebook community has a different personality and attracts a different type of user than like our forum or our docs. And in the same way for that, like as a host, you also want to just focus on like the early habits that they're building in that group. Answer the why are you here question. So get into the habit of like introducing everybody once a week that's brand new, and getting people into the habit of saying like welcome, or introducing the behavior of like, if you have a product comment or something you'd love for us to work on, go to the community, feel free to post it. And like that's the habit that it goes through. And organically, you'll start to see these sub communities kind of pop up, and essentially like organic moderators start to come through. And now it's your job to shift away from creating those base habits and structure to empowering those to kind of replicate and do more and feel more connected with that community.
And how big is the Voiceflow community right now?
So we're sitting at about 8,000 in our Facebook group, and about like 60% of them interact with us on a weekly basis, which is a ton of engagement.
Wow. Yeah.
Because like you'd be surprised when it goes from like interacting with just product updates versus like people interacting with each other. And so in that case, it will always be like a segment of kind of who our user base is, but we want that to continue to be like a great meeting ground for them. So it's exciting to see that grow kind of organically alongside our user base.
For sure. Yeah, that's amazing. So I guess to zoom out really quick and just think about kind of the broader growth strategy, and how the community is like kind of a pillar of that, I guess. The first question I have is, have you all identified any specific characteristics? Like, are the folks that are in the community, as you said, like a certain subset or a certain like segment? Do they fall into other groups or have certain characteristics?
So I think like there's like always going to be like the dominant personality in a community, and then there's like kind of some micro groups that are within there. Like for our Facebook community, for instance, is like for instance, if we were targeting like Gen Z folks for a second, like they're very anti-Facebook, they're not there. They're Discord people, for instance. However, like for us with our Facebook crew, it's like in terms of age group, like late 20s, or maybe like some students who are working in hackathons and things like that, to much older, to like in their like 50s, 60s even coming in. And because the interface lends to a different generation of users, like if you look at the distribution graph of who's excited about voice tech, like there are generations that were totally left behind from like haptic and from graphic that are interested in this space. So that I think that's really interesting. And then like more behaviorally, like you have designers or makers that I think lend a little bit more to our Facebook community than developers, who rely more closely with their habits on like looking at forums like Stack Overflow or interacting with like Discord or Discourse. And so we have our forum where most of those will hang out.
That's super interesting. So you actually have kind of multiple communities that are operating simultaneously.
Yeah, like there's definitely crossover. Like there's definitely people who are in both, and that's like a commonality for sure. But I think it's more of like like matching, similar to what I said earlier, like matching like the need with the time and the medium, and like different mediums loan to different things. And so you don't want to reinvent the wheel on like, or force function a reason for gathering on a medium that it doesn't match. So why would you want to bring that all into one place versus separate that out?
Yeah, 100%. I'd love to know a little bit about how you all think about community, I guess, as a true like acquisition channel. Like, is there something in place where we're actively trying to move folks from this Facebook group to like paying users on the platform, or how do you all think about that?
So I think like there's like a risk that kind of falls with like, what is the goal of a community? And for some people, like that's solely acquisition. It's like, okay, like here's a way for us to get brand new net users, or here's a way for us to convert people. Being in that like product-led growth camp, like it's really about like engaging, activating, and taking someone from like a casual user to a power user. So it's really more on, or at least the way that I view it earlier stage, is more about activation than it is about acquisition. And as it grows to a certain subset, and you look at like your traditional growth funnel of like your power users are far more likely to become evangelists, which are far more likely to drive really amazing, either like increased signups or really amazing referrals or become paid users themselves. There becomes like this much, like these different paths that suddenly get birthed from that community. And so I think like in the short term, it was always really, really about the activation, and still very much so is about finding more reasons why they would want to be a part of that, why they're getting more out of that than just being alone in the product. And I think it's also about like in the creative flow, being a design tool or being a designer, most of them operate in silos. And they go elsewhere to go and like talk about those things, show off their products, like go in and ask for help for things. And so this is really also about like giving an avenue for people who are traditionally in a single player mode to operate more multiplayer and be more collaborative, even if they're not directly working on something together. So in short, I personally view it as activation first, but acquisition comes from that because you're building great experiences that people then want to talk about.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I think like that's an interesting playbook just for for SaaS and a lot of product-led growth companies, because as we talked about, right, like the scale that you're trying to achieve, and a lot of times acquisition through SEO or content or paid or whatever is just like not an achievable thing, or it's a long cycle, versus like a community where you can start to generate some of those returns. I would assume on a somewhat shorter time scale. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that. Like, do you all, how do you all measure that, or to what extent are you measuring the correlation between the community and the folks who are in there and their engagement versus activation or revenue that's being generated?
Yeah, so I think like that's the tough thing about community, is like you're inherently kind of walking down this like decentralized path. Okay, like our core is we want them to be on our site or in our web app or mobile, whatever it may be. However, when you're building out these communities, it's very rare that you build those communities directly on the platform that you've already built, because it's kind of like a split product. So a lot of people inherently will now go choose like Slack or Facebook or Discord, Reddit, wherever these people are. And then now you're seeing, I think for us, like we would gauge some basic things in there of like, what's the overall growth of that group? But more importantly, I cared more about like the engagement of that group, or percentage of users within that group that are still active, because I didn't care necessarily if we had like the largest group of conversation designers out there if no one was saying anything. Like that's awful.
Right.
It's like the most awkward online experience. And so like for us, like that engagement score was very, very core. And I think like there's like the deep analytical answer to that, where there's a lot of products that are now being built to kind of make that analytics side a little bit easier, like ComScore, or like you're seeing more and more competitors even pop up to kind of go through that, where you're like plugging and playing different products or community groups and like seeing how they translate back into your product. But there's also, if community is at a core part of your growth strategy, like you can now do a couple different things, like serve up referral links solely to people that are in your community and see how that goes, or offer different subsets or different links for them to go and click and track those and see like which IDs are coming back up in your segment or in your Amplitude or whatever visualizer you're using, or even just like more relationship based. Like if there's someone who's loud and excited and great in your community, you probably know them by name. And you can probably see their engagement kind of moving forward. And I think that that's the last piece about community that's important, is that it's not all numbers, and it never will be all numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of anecdotal experiences that come with running a community, and then as you said, how do I translate that back, or how do I correlate that in some way, even if it's not in the data, or I haven't found the data to show it, which is super interesting. I think this is actually maybe a good segue. Someone had asked in the chat before we started about your tool stack. And so, obviously you all have these various communities that are kind of exist on multiple platforms. So like what tools are you using in terms of kind of managing or interacting with these communities? And then on the measurement side, you also mentioned like an Amplitude or segment. Can you just walk us through kind of what the tools are that you use on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I mean, like on a day-to-day basis, like my go-to tech stack is normally like Segment for any like data, or in particular on events, just like event triggers and capturing that and pushing that into a visualizer. And I'm pro normally Amplitude. However, we actually use Mixpanel at Voiceflow, and like in terms of like comms and stuff, like I actually really love Autopilot. I use them a lot, not Twilio's Autopilot, but instead like the email communication Autopilot, SendGrid for transactional emails versus like campaign or operational emails, which I use Autopilot for. And then beyond that, like being from more of like a design and like product background, like I really actually spend a ton of my time with my team on like FigJam more recently, or Miro, and like Figma, to actually try to like mock out what are these things and what do they look like and how do we scale that as an internal practice. And then beyond that, like automation stack is really important. So I think like one of the most underrated and powerful things that like a growth person can do is learn how to automate their day-to-day or like certain repetitive tasks so that they can free up more and more of their time for more strategic or new experiments. So like Zapier, IntegraMAT, incredibly good tools to like get under your belt and understand. Airtable, Webflow, I use all the time for my team. So like there's lots of, I think, like creative tools mixed with automation and data that I think are incredibly important for our day-to-day.
Yeah, that's awesome. Quite the range of tools there, jumping from one to the other throughout the day, I'm sure.
Definitely, but I mean, it keeps things fresh, right?
For sure. Okay, so let's kind of put things in context here, where Voiceflow is at now. So again, you all have grown from where you were when you first started, and sort of this whole new business model. This community kind of rose from the previous business model at first and has grown from there. What is, as you think about kind of the overall growth strategy of Voiceflow at this point in time, what are all the components or the channels or the pillars of that strategy?
Yeah, so I think I think this is like we're at stage like 2 maybe of like 100 that we want to go in and play around with. But I think like for us, like what has worked has been like, how can we facilitate more like areas of communication for our users, which inherently does add to our brand and who we touch kind of moving forward. I think for us, and this was the first time I've ever used this strategy really for a company, was Twitter became like a really big and amazing place for us to find like early thought leaders, makers, no code enthusiasts, like conversation designers, professional teams that were all engaging there in their free time. Because ultimately, even though we complement the maker community, we really are a really awesome team and enterprise tool. And so like part of that product-led growth strategy is always going to be creating a delightful individual user experience that builds up into them wanting to share, wanting to bring on more people, wanting to create those teams or join a team in the future. And so it became very important for us in the channels that we chose to tell that story, connect with that, and kind of build that into not just content from like what is Voiceflow producing, but who are the faces behind that company. And I think I personally, and this is obviously my biased word for it, believe that like we've done a pretty good job at making us a very community forward company, but also like a people first company, where there's often, if you talk to someone in the community, them leaning more towards being like, oh yeah, like I talked to like Emily from Voiceflow or like Mark from Voiceflow or so on and so forth. And they have those amazing connections with an individual on there in the same way that you would with building a relationship with like a friend group or recalling somebody who's an expert in X.
Right.
And so like, I think that's been a really great channel for us. And then more recently as well is like now using our platform within community and within our own publications to bring a voice to those that don't have that distribution network. And so we're seeing more and more emphasis on creating thought leadership content and guides and frameworks and opportunities for people to like break down the barriers of getting into this new interface while also giving the voice to people who are doing that really important early work and lending them a hand to directly go and connect with that community. So through workshops, webinars, blogs, and even just like candid conversations like this, because like we're still early in both the industry and kind of how we're figuring things out. And ultimately it's going to be a rising tide for whenever it's an interface shift like this.
Right. Yeah. That's super interesting because you are at kind of a forefront of this broader movement, or certainly one of the early movers in this space. And as you said, you're sort of bringing a lot of people along for the ride and sort of helping connect them along the way, which I think is super interesting. I also, one other thing I just wanted to point out for folks is you mentioned kind of this like human first approach, which I think is super fascinating. And I think if you look at a lot of great tech companies, like their marketing is has a very personal element to it, right? You think about Ahrefs, and Tim from Ahrefs is like the head of marketing, and he's like the guy that writes the blog posts, and people follow him on Twitter and interact with him directly. And I think that's super fascinating. I think like that's sort of the hidden power of like this community, is that it allows the individuals in your organization to be sort of public facing, have these interactions, and then build that connection really at scale, right?
And I think like that's an incredibly important aspect, like not just like even like leaving the company behind, is like as like a good team, you should be building up like everybody within the team's like brand, everybody within them, that they are getting opportunities to do that if that's what's interesting to them. And I find like definitely more often on marketing than perhaps other teams, there are people who like really want that opportunity to be public facing, to have the opportunity to kind of have their face next to the work that they're doing. And I find that incredibly rewarding. And like one of the things that I try really hard to do on my team, especially as we scale, is like provide those opportunities to other people, because like that happened to me early on in my career. I think that everyone deserves the opportunity to do that. And like the more and more that companies are going to start to do this trend of like building in public, building via community, like being people centric, is you're going to start to see less and less of people evangelizing over just like the brand name of a company, like you may have in like Fortune 500 days, to more so being like exactly how you just mentioned it with like Ahrefs, is like they're like people that are really freaking brilliant, that are super interesting to follow and see. Like Dave Gerhardt, for instance, who did a great job of going from like Drift over now to Privy. And like there's these elements now, or even from a company's perspective, where it's great to have a powerhouse that has that following. And that's part of that value when you bring on those people and you're creating a space that helps them while also helping the brand.
Yeah, 100%. It's a really interesting time, I think, now where we're seeing this shift from kind of like company-led social and like sort of the early, I would say like the early era really of social media, to now it's getting to this point where I think almost the original intent of social media is sort of emerging. It is becoming a little bit more personal. Like people are more interested in the person and not the logo.
I think like we're really seeing kind of a strong wave towards like the creator economy and that becoming more and more of a thing. And I think like definitely if there's one thing that took off a lot more during this pandemic was that, because we weren't spending as much time in the confounds defined by like what office we walked into and more so about like what were we working towards, like who are we working with, what are we working on. And like I think that's a very important narrative for us to continue to do if like overall as we continue to build out these new processes or new ways that people can ultimately build careers right now.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. And I think like the other thing that I keep thinking about too is that there's like a very reciprocal relationship there of like if you're building a community around your business and you're also helping to kind of build up people in your team and their sort of sphere of influence, then those things are ultimately, you know, kind of converging together to ultimately just expand the overall reach and the folks that you're reaching and the influence that you have in the space.
I think definitely. I mean, like a good example, I think of a company that does that really well is like Webflow. I saw Vlad, their CEO. This was like a while ago. I think they just hired a new head of people, I believe. And he literally just went in, used the power and reach that he already had of people who are makers, like creators, diversity followers, like people like that. And him posting up, here's our new head of people. You definitely need to give her a follow. She's about to release some really amazing things. Like there's so much power in that. And we see how much influence that has that like, I think to me, that's why like building community, understanding that at your core and like why it's going to be so important for the growth of future companies is that like that influence is real. And like our ability to provide that voice to more and more people, whether it's like earthing creators amongst a community to kind of be part of that, or it's to attract people for that reason or build up careers that way. You're seeing that all blend more and more. And we're creating a space where people can be a little bit more experimental. And I find, at least on the growth team, like that's something I really look for. And so it's a huge part of the strategy that we have where we hire people who want to think that way, who are interested in growing that way and have that at their core. And now we're giving them the resources to go be creative with that and measure that accordingly. So I think that it's really exciting to see a lot of companies doing that. And we're definitely not one of the only ones or even the best one in the space for it.
Do you, in your experience, I guess, if you're building a community or a following for like an individual, like do you view those as different? Do you approach those differently, or do they have kind of the same mechanisms?
I think like there definitely are differences because like the goal is different, right? It's like there's like, I think with community, you're building this opportunity where your goal is really to like bring everybody around one central topic, and like there are perspectives that are going to arise from that, and people are gonna, it's basically like almost like building like a village, right? It's like there's going to be subsets that come out of that, and it's about like creating clear guidelines of like, okay, like what fits within this, what are things that like we absolutely will not stand for that are just like not cool here, versus like making sure that people feel equalized the second that they come in into a community like this, so you can foster that relationship. Whereas I find like building a following, and I by no means am like a super influencer on anything, it's like a little bit more about like blending and figuring out what your voice stands for and like kind of how that person rallies people around their thought versus rallies it around a conversation. And that's just inherently like how the medium fits with it. Whereas like perhaps maybe those that are like super influencers on like Reddit might have a different opinion about that, since that is inherently more of like a conversation platform versus like Twitter, which has threads. However, it's like less so about engaging with every single comment after a certain point and more so about statements and perspective sharing.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. So I'd love to know, just to get into kind of the nuance maybe of what, you know, what that community is looking like, how it sort of functions on like a day-to-day basis. A couple of questions there. So one, I'd love to know like how is the community continuing to grow kind of day-to-day right now?
So I think like one of the things that has kind of always been part of our strategy is like when we say we're community at the core, like it's like one of the very first things that we introduce you to when you sign up. And we're very intentional about that because we know that if we want to connect early users with people who are not just us in tutorial videos to actual ways that they can be successful, it's going to be in that group. And so like we definitely experiment with from our side, making sure everyone that signs up gets that invitation, gets that opportunity to go do that. And you can find that link virtually anywhere in any of our communications. But also from the other side of like, we encourage and invite people to join that group. Or even in other kind of non-traditional ways of maybe we have like signups that come through and we hit them with an onboarding message, but maybe we have a bunch of people who joined from a hackathon. And the hackathon has like a very short lifespan of maybe like 2 days or a day. And how do we engage them moving forward so that they don't just, let's say, fade away into oblivion or a churn? How do we continue to engage them and get them excited? So I think like that's one element, or just even just being very intentional about inviting people that we want is alternative perspectives into that group. And sometimes that's as simple as like us finding somebody, shooting them off an email and telling them like, would love to hear your opinion on X, Y, and Z, or like inviting and diversifying the events and engagements that we have there so that it starts to attract different people, or it starts to kind of change its behavior towards becoming a slightly different conversation.
And what are you all as the Voiceflow team? What's the activity like in the group? Are you all creating content? What's the strategy there to kind of keep people engaged or keep people interacting?
Yeah, so I mean, like this changes over time. Like at the beginning, it's so much more hands-on. It's like you're in it, your faces are there all the time. Like you're constantly trying to like engage with people, tagging things like that. And I think now it's really just kind of moved a little bit more about like amplifying voices that are in there, like replying to things, making sure that we're responsive, making sure that people like are pointed in the right direction when things come up, or tagging people that we know would be like really great to add context to certain things. And I think like more systematically, like we're using it as like exclusive content drops or like beta access to things or other reasons that like make those people feel special for being in there, because like they play a really core part in our product. And so like the offering that we have in there is like you have early access to anything that we're pushing out, but also direct access to anyone on the team, which like we hope we can continue to scale for as long as we can. But I think like we've done a good job of kind of having a similar style relationship with a lot of people that join now versus they joined when that group was like 200 people. Right. And so like some of the posts that still remain are like the welcome stuff, any support style things, or doing exclusive live streams, to now also bringing in like exclusive like drops or content or highlights, and making sure that those are like core engagements that we have.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I love I'm always of course intrigued as a content person, you know, how you all approach the content that you're creating and sort of creating content specifically for these folks that already exist in your community, which I think is always interesting to me, because I think from my world where people come from, a lot of people associate content with, you know, search or SEO or like that stuff, and of course that's the bulk of what we do, but that's just a channel at the end of the day. Like search is a channel for content, and community and the groups that you own and manage, that's also a channel. And so creating content specifically for those folks, what is that process like? Is there kind of a feedback mechanism there where you're listening to the community and then creating content based on what you're seeing and hearing?
Oh, absolutely. Like there are examples where we like force things onto them, and there's examples where they've said something and then 8 other people echo the exact same thing, and the next thing you know, it's on the roadmap. Like it's kind of like how that works. And I think that like that's a really core part of like understanding like, okay, what's the difference in between like what we're building versus what people want. And I think with the community and the way that it ties in with content is like we see things as like, for instance, this was something that like I never would have thought of like when we first joined, but like people who are conversation designers, there's like no swag, no stickers. There's like nothing that like really acknowledges that as a job. And you spend like most of your time like highly identifying with that as a space, but you have nothing that like directly speaks to you. And so like we got a ton of requests from people being like, I would love like this like sticker that says like conversation designer on it. And I'll be like, okay, like we can do that. Or like even just like thinking about like how content even scales beyond your own means, right? So we talk a lot about, from like an SEO perspective, like you got backlinks from other people, but you also create content that's targeted towards certain traffic. In this case, like let's say, depending on your medium, like Facebook won't help you with this, but like a forum would, where if there's lots of people that are organically having conversations about a topic, it's very likely that it's deeply in line with what people are searching. And so it's a good organic and like user generated way of also systematically growing content, because like if someone has that question, it's upvoted by like 100 people, that means at minimum there's 100 people that are asking that question, but there's probably way more. And so if there is a destination that they can do that and it's on your own domain, why not have it there? So choosing where you house that as a medium is also a really good strategy to think about.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I love that, just the sort of the confluence of community and content, and we've talked in the past. Just last week we had a session talking about like customer interviews and like how do you kind of understand the needs of your actual customers and the users that you're trying to reach. And I love the all three of those things kind of converging here to say like, okay, we've got sort of this captive audience of folks who are engaged with our product. They're gonna help us learn about what they need so that we can then provide them with content or steer the product strategy or kind of whatever elements we can glean from that information.
Yeah, and I mean, like we talk about personas all the time in marketing and in growth, and I mean, like there's subsets of personas that you're going to find even in these channels, where like you have like helpers, you have like helpers, you have like passives, you have people who are questioners or people who have questions. And then you have perhaps even like contributors, like people who like actively want to get more involved, want to like lend an ear or say things. And like, as those start to earth, it's important to like have your finger on the pulse of that and make sure that like you're working with them to create the platforms that match those new needs or amplify those that are doing that and are motivated by those things. Because like even when you look at more traditional like content strategy, like we want to amplify the creators that are in there because their stories are authentic, genuine, and exciting to talk about. And like you don't want to be inherently 100% promotional all the time. Like I think that like if people wanted to look at ads all day, there wouldn't be an ad blocker. Like there's just like there's lots of things that I think become more genuine about that. And we're always, as humans, going to be more interested in that story side than anything.
For sure. So we're down to our last like 8 minutes or so here. I'd love to, I guess, take us all the way back to the early days. Looking back now, if or let's say somebody is watching this session and they say, this is the approach for us. We want to build a community-driven growth strategy around our product. What kind of advice would you give to someone kind of starting from scratch?
I would say that like A, don't overthink it, but B, like plan it as though you would like a small gathering. Like your community is only as strong as the first 10 people that you invite into it. And like make sure that it's not just like a side project if it's something that you really want to go in and try for real. And I mean that across any channel that you're doing in growth, because I think like a really big piece of the success of a lot of these things is like the resilience that comes along with those channels and those bets. And maybe your first attempt at a channel isn't the perfect end game of what you're actually looking for. But you'll never know that unless you dedicate and are like resilient about how much time and review periods you put into it, because it's the not sexy part of the experiment that ends up actually being the growth lever that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I think that applies to all channels and all types of growth, right? It's like you have to commit to a certain amount of investment, or you're never going to see the results.
Exactly.
That's super helpful. Just a couple other questions about Voiceflow and growth. I'd love to know, like, has there been anything that you all have tried that hasn't been successful?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of them that like I think is like near and dear to like my heart is like I want to provide a really good place for people to like share the projects that they're working on and like provide that value of like solving like what does like a portfolio piece look like in conversation design, because it's so solved with like graphics where you have Behance or you have Dribble or you have these elements where people are like linking things. They have images, like people are used to viewing those things. But there's so much complexity and so much nuance that goes into these conversations. Like, how do you display that? And how do you build a name for yourself there? So I think like one of the things that we had tried early on is like, it's such a no-brainer to have like a showcase of some sort. We have tried time and time again to figure out what that looks like, but it's still so early and there's still so many ways that we can go and approach that like, I feel every time that we try it, we're getting a step closer. But it's, again, one of those things where it's like, I still, in my core, believe that there's a way that we can solve this. It's just, how do we do that? What does that UX look like? And how are we meeting people where they need to be to make that or meet their needs of what they're looking for? And I think like other ways as well is like we've tried channels and not given them the love that they needed, or like we don't give them the budget that they need in order to be successful. And like, I think that that's like a startup, like very real problem that people come into is like resourcing. Is like you're almost always limited by either headcount or by budget. And so a lot of it, yes, a lot of it is like, okay, making sure that like you eliminate your like your bias or preconceived bias of a channel that you may have tried previously and not approach that with the same, like with basically like dirty data as you move forward. So I think that like that's also something, not just with Voiceflow, but in general, something that I've seen over the years.
Yeah, for sure. Are there other acquisition channels that are generally working for you guys? Are you doing I don't know, paid search, or like how do you kind of round out the strategy?
Yeah, so I've always been very biased towards leaning towards organic growth first and making sure that you have a really, really strong foundation there. We've only just really started to play around with the paid side of things. And I think like for me, the reason why I approach it that way, and you probably can agree to this being kind of an expert on top of funnel there, but like you should look at some of these channels as multipliers and some of them as like foundational. And if your foundational or like natural organic growth is X, if you go and you add paid or you go and you like supplement that with X amount of money or a different channel, then like you should be able to kind of more systematically predict its impact and kind of see what that looks like. So I think for us, like we're just starting to experiment with now pushing a lot of our content down more of a traditional like paid ad funnel. So like we just released our first ebook and guide, and that's definitely going to be more like a lead gen strategy than typically like a user sign up strategy. And same's to go with like, I think for us, there's a very obvious opportunity in SEM where people are new to this space. How can we be the top search for those things if we do not have the organic content that directly matches those queries just yet?
Yeah, 100%. That's a lot. I definitely, obviously I am biased, but I definitely agree on the organic side. I can just say, many of the folks that come to us, have sort of approached it the other way, right? So they started with paid and they've built to a certain point, and now they're realizing like, okay, there's nothing left here, and it's getting more expensive. And like, we can't sustainably grow our company by paying for every click or every visit or every sign up in the same way. So yeah, definitely seen that play out firsthand.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think for anybody that takes that organic approach, you also naturally open up other avenues that can be a little bit more fruitful when you do go down that route of trying to juice things up, like referrals, for example, or like marketplace listings or things like that, because you have this groundswell and this organic funnel already built out.
Yeah, and one, going back to the discussion we had before too, I think like the sort of feedback loop that you're building as well is hugely powerful, because now you have a lot more insight about the customers that you're trying to reach. Who are the people who are most likely to sign up? What are they looking for? What are the problems that you're solving for them? And then how can I be a lot smarter right out of the gate with how I'm spending my ad money or whatever I'm doing from a paid acquisition side.
Absolutely. And it's also like such a good gut check. Like, I find like when you hit a certain scale as well, like we're obviously a scrappy startup. However, like I've also worked in growth capacity at companies that have hundreds of employees and when you look at those things, like there's also like challenge yourself to kind of think about what are the existing resources that you have, even at that stage. So for instance, testing out content at Clio versus Voiceflow, where we had like a 90-person sales team like down the hall from me. Like we have our outbound reps, we're talking to people all the time, who are the same people I'm trying to hit with ads. Like how do I test my content with them before I ever put $1 behind it?
Right.
So like there's other ways that you can also do that testing if there is more resource sharing versus resource spending as your model.
That's awesome. Well, I think we're just at our hour. So Emily, I just wanted to say thank you so much again for joining us today. For folks on the stream, if you have not already, please find Emily on Twitter at Emily Lonetto. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insight. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, that's all for today, guys. Thanks again. As always, if you haven't, please like the video, subscribe here, and find us on top of the funnel, yesoptimist.com/TOFU. All right, we'll see you there. Thanks all. Bye-bye.